Part 1. The Curse of the Scar. The sun was a hammer over the Dawson Ranch, beating down on the cracked, thirsty earth until the land itself seemed to groan. It was a place carved out of stubbornness and defiance, where the dust settled on everything, the bleached wood of the fences, the drooping leaves of the lone cottonwood, and the silence in the heart of the girl who stood on the porch. The air was thick with the scent of dry soil and heat, a constant, oppressive presence that promised nothing but another day just like the last. Ruth Dawson knew the language of this land. It was a language of endurance, of survival without hope for softness. She was 22 years old, and her life had been shaped by two unyielding forces, the unforgiving Texas sun and the equally unforgiving gaze of her father. She carried a map of her father's disappointment on her own face. A jagged line of pale, raised flesh ran from her right temple down to the arch of her eyebrow, a permanent testament to a childhood fall from a hayloft. It was not a grotesque mark, not to a stranger's eye, but to her father, Jedediah Dawson. It was a brand. It was the flaw in his lineage, the crack in the facade of his pride. In his eyes, the scar had rendered her useless, unmarriageable, an object of shame he was forced to house. Ruth ran a calloused finger over the worn fabric of her apron, her eyes fixed on the distant, shimmering horizon. She never looked at her reflection if she could help it. The distorted image in the water bucket or the fleeting glimpse in a window pane was enough to bring her father's voice echoing back to her. A face that could curdle milk. Girl? Best keep it out of sight. So she did. She made herself small, quiet, efficient. She mended the clothes, baked the bread, tended the meager garden that fought a losing battle with the sun, and moved through the small ranch house like a ghost. Her hands were capable. Her back was strong, but her spirit had learned to curl inward, seeking shelter from the constant barrage of her father's contempt. The sound of heavy boots on the wooden porch boards broke the afternoon stillness. Jedediah Dawson was a man built like the land he worked hard, unyielding, and stripped of all unnecessary sentiment. His face was a mask of weathered leather, his jaw perpetually tight with a grim resolve. He valued two things above all else, his land and his honor. His daughter, it seemed, factored into neither. "Girl!" he barked, not bothering to look at her. His eyes were fixed on the dusty trail leading to the ranch. "We have a visitor." Ruth's heart gave a familiar, nervous flutter. Visitors were rare, and they seldom brought good news. She followed his gaze and saw a lone rider approaching. The figure was lean, sitting tall in the saddle with a stillness that was unnerving. He didn't ride like a ranch hand or a traveler seeking water. He moved with a kind of liquid grace, as if he and the horse were one creature born of the desert itself. As he drew closer, she could make out the details. He was a man caught between two worlds. He wore the worn trousers of a cavalryman, but his feet were clad in soft, beaded moccasins. His black hair was long, tied back with a simple leather thong, and his skin was the color of rich, sun-baked earth. But it was his face that held her attention. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes that seemed to hold the vast, unblinking patience of the desert itself. He was, Ruth realized with a jolt, an Indian, or part Indian, at least. She had heard the whispers in the nearby town of Redemption tales of a Half-Apache scout named Elijah Greyhawk, a man trusted by the army but viewed with suspicion by everyone else, a man who belonged nowhere. The rider halted his horse a respectful distance from the porch and dismounted in a single, fluid motion. He didn't speak, just stood there, his presence a quiet challenge to the oppressive heat. Jedediah stepped forward, his posture rigid. "Greyhawk," he said, his voice clipped. It was a statement, not a greeting. Elijah Greyhawk simply inclined his head, his gaze sweeping over Jedediah before briefly, impassively, landing on Ruth for a heartbeat. Their eyes met. Ruth felt a strange sensation, a flush of heat that had nothing to do with the sun. His eyes held no pity, no disgust. None of the reactions she was used to when men looked at her scar. They held only a calm, measuring watchfulness. Then he looked away. "The matter we discussed," Jedediah continued, his voice loud, performative. He wanted this to be a public declaration. The debt, it's time it was settled. Ruth's hands tightened on her apron. A debt she knew her father was land poor, always struggling to make ends meet, his pride far exceeding his purse. But what debt could be so great that it brought a man like Elijah Greyhawk to their door? "I have what was agreed," Elijah said. His voice was low and quiet, yet it carried with the clarity of a stone dropping into a deep well. It held a rough, gravelly texture, the sound of a man who did not waste words. Jedediah gave a curt, cruel smile. He turned his head and finally looked directly at his daughter. The contempt in his eyes was a physical blow. "Girl, come here." Hesitantly, Ruth moved forward until she stood beside him. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, the angry tension coiled within him. "Greyhawk," Jedediah announced, his voice ringing with a perverse satisfaction. "I present your payment, my daughter, Ruth." The world stopped. The buzzing of the flies, the distant cry of a hawk, the very beating of her own heart. It all went silent. Ruth stared at her father, certain she had misheard. But the triumphant, malicious glint in his eyes told her it was true. He wasn't selling livestock. He was selling her. The arrangement was for a wife, Jedediah continued, ignoring the blood draining from Ruth's face. "A binding arrangement. You saved my hide from the Comanches last spring. A debt of honor. I'm a man of my word. I'm giving you a wife to settle it." He gestured toward Ruth as if displaying a mare at auction. "She's strong, healthy, obedient. And with that mark on her face, it's not as if any decent white man would have her. She'll suit your purposes well enough." Each word was a nail hammered into her soul. Suit your purposes. He had spoken of her as if she were a tool, a piece of property to be bartered away to settle a score. The public humiliation washed over her in a suffocating wave. She was standing on the porch of her own home, being traded away to a Half-Apache stranger, her only value measured by her father's desperation and her own perceived ugliness. She risked a glance at Elijah Greyhawk. His expression had not changed. He looked from Jedediah to her, his dark eyes unreadable. What was he thinking? Did he see the shame burning in her cheeks? Did he feel any satisfaction in this cruel transaction? He offered no clue. His stillness was a wall she could not see beyond. "She will do," Elijah said finally. Just those 3 words. They were not spoken with cruelty, nor with kindness. They were a simple statement of fact, an acceptance of terms. He had inspected the goods and found them acceptable. The finality of it stole Ruth's breath. This was happening. This was her life, being decided for her on a sun-scorched porch by 2 men who saw her as nothing more than a pawn in their game of honor and debt. Jedediah clapped his hands together, a sound like 2 dry boards smacking. "Then the matter is settled. The debt is paid." He turned to Ruth, his face a mask of cold dismissal. "Go on, then. He's waiting." Ruth stood frozen, her feet rooted to the wooden planks. Go where like this, in a worn calico dress and scuffed boots, with nothing but the clothes on her back. "Did you hear me?" Girl Jedediah's voice was a low growl. "Your husband is waiting. You are his concern now." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper meant only for her. "This is what you have earned with that face. You've been a blight on my house since the day you were marked. Now you can be a blight on his." Something inside Ruth, something that had been dormant for years, began to fracture. It was the last fragile shell of hope she had unknowingly harbored, the foolish, childish hope that one day her father might see past the scar. That hope died in the heat of that afternoon, and in its place, a cold, hard ember of defiance began to glow. He was right. No decent white man would have her, not with the meager dowry her father could provide. She was an outcast, a burden, and now she was being handed to another outcast, a man who lived between worlds, belonging to neither. Perhaps, she thought with a surge of bitter clarity, that was exactly where she belonged, too. She would not cry. She would not beg. She would not give Jedediah Dawson the satisfaction of seeing her break. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her, but her pride was a thin steel rod running up her spine. It was all she had left. With a slowness that felt deliberate, monumental, Ruth lifted her chin. She looked past her father, past the man who had just discarded her like a piece of trash, and met the steady, waiting gaze of Elijah Greyhawk. Her heart was a wild bird beating against her ribs, a frantic prisoner in a cage of bone. But her eyes were clear. She would not be a weeping, pathetic victim. She would be what the land had taught her to be, a survivor. She took a single, shaky breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked down the 3 steps from the porch, leaving the only home she had ever known. She stopped a few feet from Elijah, the dust of the yard settling on the hem of her dress. She did not look at him, but stared straight ahead, at the endless, unforgiving expanse of the West that was now to be her future. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Behind her, she heard the screen door slam shut. Jedediah was gone. He had closed the door on her, and on this chapter of his life, she was alone with the stranger who now owned her. Elijah Greyhawk made no move to touch her. He simply turned and walked to his horse, untying a water skin from the saddle. He walked back and held it out to her. His movements were economical, precise. "Drink," he said. His voice, so close now, startled her. She looked up at him, at the impassive lines of his face. She took the skin, her fingers brushing his. His hand was warm and dry, the skin tough. She drank deeply, the tepid water a balm to her parched throat. When she was finished, she handed it back. "Thank you," she whispered, the words scratching their way out. He nodded, tying the skin back onto his saddle. Then he looked at her, his gaze finally lingering for more than a second. It traveled from her worn boots up to the scar on her forehead. Ruth braced herself for the inevitable flinch, the flicker of distaste. It never came. His eyes held hers, and for the first time she thought she saw something beyond the watchful stillness. It was not pity, it was not kindness. It was a flicker of something that looked like understanding, as if he, too, knew what it was to be marked, to be judged, to be cast out. "The journey is long," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We walk until dusk." He turned without another word and started walking, leading his horse, not looking back to see if she would follow. He expected her to. He had taken ownership of her, and this was the first command. For a long moment, Ruth stood motionless in the dust, the sun beating down on her head. She was leaving behind a life of quiet misery for a future of complete uncertainty. She was being sent into the wilderness with a man she did not know, a man her father had called a savage. It was a punishment, a banishment. But as she watched his straight, solitary figure move steadily away from the ranch, a strange thought took root in her heart. This was not just a punishment. It was also an escape. For the first time in her life, she was walking away from Jedediah Dawson's suffocating judgment. She was walking away from the constant, whispered reminders of her own ugliness. She didn't know what lay ahead. It might be a different kind of cruelty, a different kind of hardship, but it would be different. And in that difference lay a tiny, dangerous seed of possibility. With her pride as her only shield, Ruth Dawson took a deep breath and followed her new husband into the vast, indifferent silence of the desert. Part 2, The Path of Exile. The world beyond the Dawson Ranch was a furnace, the red-orange dust, fine as flour, puffed up with every step, clinging to the hem of Ruth's dress and coating her worn leather boots in a layer of grime. It worked its way into the lines of her hands, the folds of her clothes, and the back of her throat. This was the trail her father had banished her to, a path of exile paved with heat and silence. Elijah Greyhawk moved with an economy of motion that Ruth found both mesmerizing and infuriating. He set a relentless pace, his long legs eating up the dry ground. The reins of his horse held loosely in one hand. The animal, a sturdy buckskin, followed without protest, its hooves stirring up more of the ubiquitous red dust. He never once offered her the horse. The unspoken message was clear: this journey was hers to make on her own 2 feet. This was the first rule of her new life. You carry your own weight. For the first hour, anger was the fuel that kept her moving. A hot, searing rage at her father, Jedediah. She pictured him sitting at his supper table in the cool of the evening, satisfied and unburdened, having traded his shame for a clear conscience. The injustice of it was a bitter taste in her mouth. She had spent her life trying to be invisible, to earn a crumb of affection through tireless work, and her reward was to be cast out like a stray dog. But anger, like water, evaporates under the relentless sun. Soon, the rage was baked out of her, replaced by a dull, throbbing ache that started in her ankles and worked its way up to her spine. Her dress, made of sturdy but heavy calico, felt like a lead blanket. Sweat trickled down her temples, stinging the edges of her scar, and plastered loose strands of her brown hair to her cheeks. The vast, empty landscape offered no shade. Only the occasional skeletal mesquite or prickly pear cactus, their shapes twisted as if in agony. Elijah walked beside her, but not with her. He kept a distance of several feet, a silent, watchful guardian on the periphery of her suffering. He never spoke. The only sounds were the plodding of the horse, the scuff of their feet on the hard-packed earth, and the ceaseless, high-pitched hum of insects in the parched grass. To Ruth, who had grown up with the familiar sounds of a working ranch, the lowing of cattle, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, her father's booming commands, this profound silence was more unnerving than any threat. It was the sound of utter isolation. He stopped only twice in the long hours of the afternoon. The first time, he paused under the meager shade of a rocky overhang, took the waterskin from his saddle, and handed it to her without a word. She drank greedily, the water tasting of leather and dust, but feeling like life itself. He drank after her, his throat moving in a long, slow swallow, his eyes scanning the horizon. He seemed less a man and more a part of the landscape itself, as attuned to its rhythms and dangers as a coyote. The second time he stopped, the sun was beginning to dip towards the jagged peaks in the west, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. He gestured to a flat, sun-baked rock. Rest. Ruth collapsed onto it, not caring about the residual heat that seeped through her dress. Her legs trembled with exhaustion. She closed her eyes, and the image of her father's cruel, triumphant smile flashed behind her lids. She was his debt, paid in full. A walking, breathing piece of currency, now spent. Was this man, this Elijah Greyhawk, her new owner? Was he leading her to a life of servitude, a different kind of cage from the one she had just escaped? She watched him from under her lashes. He checked the horse's hooves with a gentle, practiced hand, murmuring something low in a language she didn't understand. The horse nudged his shoulder affectionately. There was a quiet tenderness in the gesture that seemed at odds with the harshness of his world. He was not a brute. She had seen brutes among the ranch hands her father sometimes hired, men with loud voices, cruel laughter, and heavy hands. Elijah was nothing like them. His silence was not menacing. It was contained, as if he held all his words and thoughts deep inside, where they wouldn't be wasted. The pride that had carried her off the porch had been eroded by the journey, worn down to a raw nub of desperation. She had been defined her entire life by the scar on her face. It was the first thing people saw, the lens through which they judged her. Her father, the women in town, the traveling merchants. Their eyes always flickered to it before their faces settled into expressions of pity, curiosity, or disdain. She had expected the same from this man. She had waited for the sneer, the dismissive glance, the insult couched as a joke. But it hadn't come. His gaze was direct, unwavering, and utterly neutral. He had looked at her scar, yes, but he had looked at it the same way he looked at a rock, or a cloud, or the trail ahead, as if it were simply a feature of the terrain, a thing that existed, neither good nor bad. The question had been building in her all afternoon, a pressure behind her ribs. It was a foolish question, a weak question, but she could no longer bear the weight of the silence and the uncertainty. She had to know. She had to understand the nature of this man who now held her future in his hands. Her voice, when she finally used it, was a dry, cracked whisper, almost lost in the vastness. "Why?" He stopped his tending of the horse and turned his head slowly towards her. His face was in shadow, his expression unreadable. "Why what?" She took a ragged breath, forcing the words out. "Why don't you mock me?" The question hung in the air between them, fragile and pathetic. She immediately regretted it, a hot flush of shame rising to her cheeks. She had shown him her weakness, the raw wound her father had spent years carving into her spirit. He didn't answer right away. He walked over to her, his moccasins making no sound on the dusty ground. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to look up at him. The last rays of the setting sun caught the sharp planes of his face, making the line of his jaw seem as if it were carved from granite. His dark eyes held hers, and for the first time, she felt truly seen. Not assessed, not judged, but simply seen. He contemplated her question as if it were a serious philosophical inquiry, not the desperate plea of a frightened girl. His gaze was so intense it felt as if he could see right through her skin to the frantic, fluttering heart beneath. Finally, he spoke, his voice the low, gravelly sound of stones rolling in a dry riverbed. "Because words don't change the desert," he said, his gaze sweeping for a moment to the endless, rugged horizon before returning to her face. "And they don't change you." The simplicity of the statement struck her with the force of a physical blow. It was not a compliment. It was not an assurance. It was a fact, delivered with the same unadorned truth as the sun's heat or the ground's hardness. In her father's house, words had been everything. They were whips and cages, weapons used to diminish her, to define her, to keep her in her place. Ugly, worthless, burden. These were the words that had built the walls of her prison. Elijah's words did the opposite. They dismantled the prison. He was telling her that her scar, the defining feature of her entire existence, was irrelevant to the world they now inhabited. The desert did not care if she was beautiful or plain. It demanded strength, endurance, and will. Nothing more. His words implied that he, a man of the desert, judged by the same metrics. The mark on her skin was no more significant than the color of her eyes. It was simply a part of her. It did not define her worth. For the first time since she was a little girl, before the fall, before the scar, before her father's love had curdled into contempt, Ruth felt a loosening in her chest. It was as if a tightly bound cord had been cut. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, hot and sudden, but she blinked them away fiercely. Crying was a luxury, and she had a feeling there would be no room for luxuries where they were going. But something had shifted, irrevocably. A seed had been planted in the barren ground of her heart. It was not hope, not yet. It was something smaller, more fragile, the possibility of trust. He turned away, his point made, and went back to his horse. He pulled a small sack from his saddlebags and took out 2 long strips of dried meat. He handed one to her. It was tough and salty, and she had to tear at it with her teeth. But it was the most satisfying meal she had ever eaten. They ate in silence as the sky deepened to a bruised purple and the first stars began to prick the darkness. The silence no longer felt empty or threatening. It felt peaceful, a shared space, not a void between them, When they were finished, he laid out a single bedroll near the fading warmth of the rocks. "Sleep," he commanded softly. He himself did not seem to require sleep. He sat with his back against a boulder, a rifle across his lap, and stared out into the darkness, a motionless silhouette against the star-dusted sky. Ruth lay down, pulling the rough wool blanket up to her chin. Her body ached with a profound weariness, but her mind was strangely calm. The path of exile had been brutal, a stripping away of everything she had ever known. But perhaps, she thought, as she drifted into an exhausted sleep, it was not an exile from life. Perhaps it was an exile from shame, and that, she realized, was a kind of freedom. Part 3. The Stranger in the Apache Camp. They walked for another day, the terrain slowly changing from flat, sun-baked earth to rolling hills dotted with juniper and hardy pinon pines. The air grew thinner, cleaner. Ruth felt the change in Elijah before she saw it, a subtle easing of the tension in his shoulders, a shift in his watchfulness from the broad horizon to the specific signs of the trail. He was nearing home. The camp was not visible until they were almost upon it. It was nestled in a wide, shallow canyon, sheltered from the wind and hidden from casual eyes by the natural contours of the land. The first sign of life was a thin wisp of smoke curling lazily into the brilliant blue sky. Then came the sounds. Carried on the breeze, the rhythmic thump of stone on stone, the high-pitched laughter of children, the sharp bark of a dog. Finally, the smells reached her wood smoke, roasting meat, the pungent scent of cedar, and something else, something sweet and earthy she couldn't name. As they crested the final rise, the entire settlement, the rancheria, spread out below them. It was nothing like the rigid, angular world of Redemption or her father's ranch. This was a place of curves and circles. Dozens of dome-shaped dwellings, wickiups, constructed of bent branches and covered in brush or hides, were scattered in a seemingly random but organic pattern. Hides were stretched on frames, drying in the sun. Women in deerskin dresses moved with unhurried purpose, tending to fires, grinding corn on flat stones, or weaving baskets from yucca fibers. Children, clad in little more than breechcloths, chased each other through the camp, their bare feet kicking up dust. When Elijah led the horse down the final slope, a hush fell over the community. The laughter of the children died. The rhythmic grinding stopped. Every head turned, and every pair of dark, intelligent eyes fixed on the strange, pale woman walking in the Half-Apache's shadow. Ruth felt the weight of their collective gaze like a physical touch. She had been stared at her whole life because of her scar. But this was different. This was not the furtive, pitying glance of a townswoman. This was a deep, soul-searching appraisal. They looked at her dust-caked face, her sweat-stained calico dress that was now torn at the hem, her clumsy, exhausted gait. They looked at her as if she were a new and possibly dangerous species of animal that their scout had dragged home. Her hand instinctively flew to her forehead, her fingers tracing the familiar, hated ridge of her scar. The old shame, her constant companion, washed over her. She was an outsider, a freak. Her father's words echoed in her mind. A blight on my house. Would she be a blight here? Too, a burden on these people who already lived so close to the edge of survival. She felt her spine begin to curve, her shoulders to slump, her entire body wanting to shrink and disappear. Then she remembered Elijah's words in the desert. Words don't change you. She forced her hand down to her side, clenched it into a fist, and straightened her back. She would not cower. She had survived Jedediah Dawson. She would survive this. Elijah seemed oblivious to the attention. He led his horse toward the center of the camp, stopping near a large, communal fire pit. An old man with a face as wrinkled and intricate as a dried riverbed rose to greet him. They spoke in the Apache tongue, a cascade of guttural sounds and soft vowels that was completely impenetrable to Ruth. Elijah's tone was respectful, but the old man's was questioning. His sharp eyes flickered to Ruth several times, his expression grim. She was the subject of their debate. She was the problem to be solved. She stood alone, a pale island in a sea of brown skin and black hair, feeling more conspicuous and helpless than she ever had in her life. Just as the knot of anxiety in her stomach tightened to an unbearable degree, a small group of women approached. They stopped a few feet away, their faces impassive masks. One was old, her hair streaked with gray, her eyes holding the wisdom of 1,000 seasons. The others were younger, their gazes a mixture of suspicion and undisguised curiosity. The old woman's eyes lingered on Ruth's scar for a long moment, but there was no disgust in her look. It was the calm, assessing gaze of a healer examining a wound. Then, the old woman gave a short, sharp nod. One of the younger women stepped forward. She was carrying two things: a clean, folded garment of softly tanned deerskin and a clay bowl filled with cool, clear water. She held them out to Ruth. Ruth stared at the offerings, confused. It was the old woman who finally spoke, her voice raspy with age. She pointed a bony finger at Ruth's filthy dress, then at the clean one, and then made a simple washing motion with her hands. The meaning was unmistakable. "You are dirty. Make yourself clean." It was not a gesture of friendship. It was a practical command, a matter of hygiene and propriety. But to Ruth, who had expected nothing but scorn and rejection, it felt like an act of profound humanity. They did not see her as a person to be welcomed, not yet, but they saw her as a person. They acknowledged her weariness, her filth from the trail. In this simple, unsentimental offering of water and clean clothes, there was more charity than she had received in a decade from her own blood. With trembling hands, she took the bowl and the deerskin dress. She whispered, "Thank you," though she knew they would not understand the words. The woman who had given them to her simply nodded and stepped back, rejoining the silent, watching group. Elijah ended his conversation with the elder and turned to her. He gestured with his head toward one of the smaller wickiups on the edge of the camp. "This is ours," he said. "There is privacy behind it." He did not escort her or offer to stand guard. He trusted her to understand and to manage on her own. He was not her keeper. He was, as he had said in the desert, a bridge. He had brought her here, but she would have to be the one to cross into this new world. Behind the small dwelling, sheltered from the prying eyes of the camp, Ruth stripped off the heavy, sweat-soaked calico dress. It was the last remnant of her old life, and she let it fall to the red dust without a moment's hesitation. She used a piece of the fabric and the water from the bowl to wash away the grime of the journey. The water was shockingly cold, and it made her skin tingle. As she scrubbed the dust from her arms and face, she felt as if she were washing away more than just dirt. She was washing away Ruth Dawson, the scarred and shamed daughter of Jedediah. She was washing away years of humiliation and loneliness. The deerskin dress was softer than she could have imagined, supple and light against her skin. It smelled of wood smoke, pine, and some other wild, clean scent. It had no intricate buttons or corsetry. It was a simple, sleeveless tunic that fell to her mid-calves, tied at the waist with a leather thong. Putting it on, she felt different, lighter. The rigid confinement of her old clothes was gone, replaced by a freedom of movement she had never known. But she also felt utterly fraudulent, a pale-skinned pretender in a stolen costume. When she emerged from behind the wickiup, the stares had lessened. The camp was returning to its normal rhythm. The women had gone back to their work, though Ruth could feel their eyes on her now and then. She saw her calico dress lying in the dust, a sad, discarded heap. A moment later, one of the younger women walked over, picked it up with 2 fingers as if it were something distasteful, and tossed it into the nearest cook fire. The fabric blackened, curled, and was consumed by the flames. Her past was literally turning to ash. Elijah was waiting for her, tending to his horse. He glanced at her, taking in her changed appearance. His face betrayed no emotion, but a flicker of something approval acknowledgement passed through his dark eyes before it was gone. "You are hungry," he stated. He led her to a fire where a woman was roasting pieces of rabbit on a spit. The woman offered them 2 pieces on a flat piece of bark. Ruth ate hungeringly, the smoky, savory meat a welcome change from the tough jerky of the trail. As night fell, the camp transformed. Fires glowed like scattered embers in the growing darkness. The air grew cool, and the murmur of the Apache language became a soft, intimate hum. Someone began to play a flute, a haunting, breathy melody that seemed to speak of wind and lonely places. Ruth sat on a blanket Elijah had laid out for her near the entrance of their wickiup. He sat a few feet away, mending a piece of tack, his hands moving with efficient, practiced grace. He did not try to explain the sounds or the customs. He simply provided his quiet, steady presence, an anchor in the swirling currents of her confusion. She was a burden here. She knew it with a certainty that was bone deep. She knew none of the skills these women possessed. She could not tan a hide, find edible roots, weave a watertight basket, or even speak a single word to make her needs known. She was as useless as a newborn, and the thought filled her with a familiar, sinking despair. But mingled with the despair was that other, more powerful feeling that had been growing since the desert, a fierce, desperate yearning to be accepted. She watched the families gathered around their fires, the easy intimacy between them, the way the children climbed into their mothers' laps. She saw a community, a web of connections that held each person, giving them a place and a purpose. She had never had that. She had only ever been an outsider in her own home. Here, she was an outsider by definition. But was it possible that here, being an outsider was a starting point, not a final judgment? She looked at Elijah, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. He was her only connection to this world, the man who had brought her to this strange and frightening place. He was half Apache, half white, a man who belonged fully to neither people. He was a bridge, not just for her, but in his very being. Perhaps he, of all people, could understand her desperate need to find a place to belong. The flute music faded, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the soft whisper of the wind through the canyon. Ruth drew the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She was a stranger, adrift in a new and alien world. She was terrified. But as she listened to the quiet, living pulse of the camp around her, she realized she was no longer lonely. Part 4. Lessons in Survival. The first morning in the Apache camp, Ruth awoke to a world already in motion. The cool, pre-dawn air was alive with the scent of cedar smoke and the low murmur of a language she didn't understand. Peeking out of the wickiup, she saw the community functioning like a well-oiled machine. Women were already at work, their hands moving with the familiar, efficient grace of long practice. Children were fetching water from a distant stream, and the men were checking their weapons or preparing for the day's hunt. And Ruth sat useless. The deerskin dress felt comfortable, but it was a costume she had not yet earned. She was a hollow space in the bustling life of the camp, an extra mouth to feed who brought no skills to the fire. The feeling of being a burden, which had lessened during the journey, returned with a vengeance. At her father's ranch, she had been a drudge, but she had been a competent drudge. Her bread always rose. Her stitches were always neat. Here, her skills were as worthless as a paper dollar in a flood. Her idleness did not go unnoticed. The women would glance at her as they passed, their expressions not unkind, but questioning. The old woman who had given her the dress Ruth had heard the others call her Tala watched her with sharp, bird-like eyes that seemed to see right through her. The first lesson came without warning. Tala walked up to where Ruth was sitting, took her firmly by the arm, and led her to a flat rock where several women were grinding mesquite beans into flour, using a smooth, oblong handstone, a mano, against a larger, grooved stone base. The metate. Tala pointed to an empty metate, then to a basket of dried beans, and then looked at Ruth expectantly. The message was clear. May work. Shame and gratitude warred within her. She was being included, but she was also being tested. She knelt, mimicking the posture of the other women. She took a handful of the hard, dry beans and placed them on the stone. The work looked simple enough, a steady, rocking motion of grinding the beans into powder. Her first attempt was a disaster. The mano was heavier than it looked, and she couldn't find the right rhythm. She pushed too hard, and the stone slipped, scraping her knuckles raw against the metate. A sharp pain shot up her arm. She let out a small, involuntary cry. A few of the younger women looked over in a ripple of quiet. Knowing amusement passed between them. It wasn't malicious, but it made Ruth's face burn with humiliation. Back home, she was the one who was competent, the one who knew the rhythms of the kitchen. Here, she was a clumsy child. She gritted her teeth, blinking back the hot tears of frustration, and tried again. Slower this time. She focused on the woman next to her, watching the way her shoulders and hips moved in a smooth, continuous motion, a dance of practiced efficiency. Ruth tried to copy it, her muscles screaming in protest. The work was brutally hard, an agony for her unaccustomed back and arms. After an hour, she had produced only a pitifully small pile of coarse, gritty meal, while the woman beside her had already filled a small basket with fine flour. When Elijah returned from checking his snares, he found her slumped by the stone, her hands blistered, her face streaked with sweat and dust, staring at her meager results in despair. He looked at her hands, then at the small pile of flour. He didn't say a word about her failure. "Come," he said simply. "There are other things to learn." He led her away from the women's work area, toward the creek that trickled through the edge of the canyon. He stopped and began gathering tinder dry grass, shredded bark, a handful of fluffy cattail seeds. He produced a fire drill, a simple stick with a handhold, and a flat piece of wood with a small notch in it. "Every person must know how to call fire," he said, his voice low and serious. "Fire is life. Without it, the desert will claim you." He showed her how to set it up, how to brace the fireboard with her foot, how to hold the drill and spin it between her palms. His hands briefly covered hers, adjusting her grip. His touch was impersonal, the touch of a teacher, but the warmth of his skin against hers sent a strange jolt through her. It was the first time a man had touched her with anything other than anger or dismissal. He made it look effortless. Within a minute of his palms flying back and forth, a thin wisp of smoke appeared, followed by a glowing red ember in the notch. He carefully tipped the ember into the bundle of tinder and blew on it gently until it burst into a small, bright flame. Then it was her turn, for the next hour. Ruth fought a losing battle with the stick and the wood. She couldn't spin the drill fast enough. Her palms grew slick with sweat, and the stick kept slipping. When she finally managed to generate friction, all she produced was a curl of bitter smoke and a sore spot on the wood. Her arms ached, her back throbbed, and her frustration mounted until she wanted to scream and hurl the useless tools into the creek. "I can't," she finally gasped, dropping the drill. "It's no use." Elijah, who had been watching in his usual profound silence, knelt beside her. "You are trying to force it," he said. "The fire does not like to be forced. It likes rhythm. It wants to be coaxed. Listen." He began to spin the drill again, and she heard it, a steady, whirring whisper. "Shh." "It is a song," he said. "Find the song. The heat will follow." She picked up the drill again. She closed her eyes, ignoring the ache in her body, and focused only on the sound. Shh. She let the rhythm guide her hands, faster and faster, until she felt a different kind of heat in the wood, a focused, intense point of friction. A wisp of smoke, thicker this time, curled up. Her heart leaped. She kept going, pushing past the pain. her breath coming in ragged gasps. And then she saw it, a tiny, miraculous red spark, glowing like a sleeping coal in the dark dust of the notch. "Now," Elijah said, his voice calm and urgent. With trembling hands, she tipped the ember into the tinder bundle she had prepared. She cupped it in her palms, brought it to her lips, and blew, gently, steadily, just as he had shown her. The ember glowed brighter, and then, with a soft whoosh, the tinder ignited, the flame licking at her fingers. She dropped it in surprise, but the small pile of grass was burning. She had made fire. She stared at the flames, her chest heaving. It was a small, pitiful fire, but she had created it from nothing but wood and will. A feeling she had never known before bloomed in her chest, a fierce, possessive pride. She looked up at Elijah, a triumphant smile breaking across her face. His expression was unreadable as ever, but she saw a faint crinkle at the corners of his eyes. It was, she thought, the closest he ever came to a smile. "Good," he said. "Tomorrow, you will do it again." The next lesson was harder. A few days later, he returned from a morning hunt and laid 2 rabbits at her feet. They were limp and warm, their dark eyes glassy. "We will eat tonight," he said, "but first, the animal must be honored. Nothing is wasted." At the ranch, rabbit stew appeared in a bowl. The act of turning a soft, furry creature into a meal was a violent mystery that happened in the smokehouse, out of sight. Now, the mystery was laid bare at her feet. Her stomach turned. Elijah handed her a knife. It was his, the blade sharp and clean, the handle worn smooth from use. "You know what must be done." She stared at the dead animal, then at the knife. I've never... "I will show you," he said. His patience was a tangible thing, a quiet space he created around her. He knelt and, with a few deft, precise cuts, showed her how to open the rabbit and remove the entrails, which he set aside, for the snares. He explained. He showed her where to make the incision around the legs, how the skin, once started, could be peeled back cleanly, like a coat. His instructions were practical, detached. He spoke of the rabbit not as a victim of violence, but as a gift that provided sustenance. His reverence for the animal, for the act, slowly calmed her own revulsion. This was not cruelty, this was survival. He handed the second rabbit to her. "Your turn." Her hands shook as she took the knife. The blade felt alien and heavy. Her first cut was clumsy, too deep. She ruined a piece of the meat and felt a fresh wave of shame. But Elijah didn't criticize. "Again," he said softly. "The blade knows the way. Let it do the work." She took a deep breath and tried again. This time, she focused on his instructions, on the memory of his precise movements. She worked slowly, awkwardly, her hands becoming covered in blood. It was messy, gruesome work, but as she peeled the hide away, revealing the muscle beneath, a strange sense of accomplishment began to replace her disgust. She was doing it. She was preparing the food they would eat. She was not just a helpless mouth to feed. When she was finally finished, her work a clumsy imitation of his, she felt drained but strangely empowered. She had faced the raw, bloody reality of survival and had not flinched away. She spent the following days practicing. She made the morning fire, slowly mastering its song. She ground the mesquite beans, her pile of flour growing larger and finer each day. The other women still watched her, but the amusement in their eyes was gradually replaced by a quiet, neutral respect. She was still clumsy, still the strange white woman, but she was trying. She was working. One evening, as she was scraping the rabbit hide she had inexpertly tanned, Elijah came to sit by the fire opposite her. He watched her work for a long time. Then he held out his hand. In his palm lay a knife. It was not his, this one was smaller. The blade shaped for utility work, the handle made of smooth, pale bone. It was perfectly balanced, simple and beautiful. She stared at it, then at him, not understanding. "This is yours," he said. "A person without a knife is a person without hands. It is a tool. It will feed you. It will protect you. It is your responsibility." He was giving her a tool, but it was so much more than that. Her father had given her orders. The world had given her shame. Elijah was giving her trust. He was giving her responsibility for her own survival. He was acknowledging her not as a wife that had been forced upon him, not as a burden, but as a partner in this harsh and demanding life. She reached out and took the knife. The bone handle was cool and solid in her palm. The weight of it was real, substantial. It was the first thing of true value she had ever owned. She closed her fingers around it, the smooth bone a comfort against her calloused skin. She looked at her hands, stained with dye from the hide, a fresh blister on her thumb, a healing scrape across her knuckles. They were not the hands of the girl who had left the Dawson Ranch. They were the hands of a woman who could make fire, who could dress an animal, who could grind her own flour. She looked up at Elijah, his face cast in the warm glow of the firelight. "Thank you," she whispered. And for the first time, she felt a small, steady flame of confidence ignite within her. It wasn't much, but like the embers she had coaxed from the fire drill, she knew it was enough to build a life on. Part V, music and scars. The weeks bled into one another, each day marked by the rising sun and the rhythms of the camp. Ruth found her place in the endless cycle of work. Her hands, once soft from mending and baking, were now stained, calloused, and capable. She could make fire with a patient rhythm, grind mesquite beans into a sweet flour, and her skill with a bone-handled knife grew daily. She was no longer idle, no longer a complete stranger. She was a quiet presence, the white woman who worked as hard as any other, her silence mistaken for timidity, but born of a deep, watchful learning. Yet a chasm remained. She shared work with the other women, but not their language, their laughter, or their history. In the evenings, when families gathered around their fires, their voices weaving a soft tapestry of community, Ruth felt a familiar ache of loneliness. She and Elijah existed in a space of quiet companionship, a partnership of survival, but the territory of the heart remained unexplored. One night, after a long day of gathering piñon nuts, the air was still and cool, the sky a vast sweep of glittering stars. The camp was hushed, the fires burning down to glowing embers. Ruth sat on a blanket outside their wickiup, rubbing the ache from her shoulders. Elijah, who had been cleaning his rifle with focused intensity, set it aside. He reached into a leather parfleche bag and drew out something she had never seen before, a simple, hand-carved wooden flute. He settled with his back against a rock, the firelight casting his strong features in flickering shadows, and brought the flute to his lips. The first note that emerged was so pure and gentle, it seemed to make the very air vibrate. It was a sound of profound loneliness, a single, clear voice crying out in the vast wilderness. Then, other notes joined it, weaving a melody that was as complex and beautiful as the land itself. The music spoke of wind whistling through canyons, of the patient waiting of a hunter, of the deep, enduring sadness of a people caught between worlds. It was Elijah's soul, made into sound. Ruth sat motionless, captivated. The music flowed over her, a current of pure, unadorned emotion. It bypassed the barriers of language and custom and spoke directly to the scarred and silent places within her own heart. The harsh world of the Dawson Ranch, with its rigid rules and unspoken cruelties, had no music in it. The only sounds she associated with her father were the sharp crack of his voice, the heavy thud of his boots, the cold silence of his disapproval. His words had been stones, thrown to bruise and to break. A blight on my house, a face that could curdle milk, useless. The memories, usually so sharp and painful, rose in her mind. But tonight, they had no power. The flute's melody wrapped around them, not erasing them, but soothing their jagged edges. The music did not deny the existence of pain. It acknowledged it, held it, and then transformed it into a thing of melancholic beauty. It was a song of survival, a testament to the fact that even in the harshest ground, something beautiful could grow. It was a song that understood scars. Tears she didn't know she was holding welled in her eyes and slipped, hot and silent, down her cheeks. They were not tears of self-pity, but of release. For the first time, she felt the iron band of grief and shame that had squeezed her heart for years begin to loosen. She was listening to the sound of healing. The music finally faded into the night, the last note hanging in the air like a ghost before disappearing. Elijah lowered the flute, his eyes closed for a long moment. When he opened them, he found her watching him, the firelight glistening on the wet tracks of her tears. He did not speak, did not question. He simply held her gaze, and in that shared silence, a new and deeper understanding passed between them. A few nights later, that fragile peace was shattered. The evening meal was over, and a group of children were playing a spirited game of tag, their shrieks of laughter echoing through the camp. A small boy of about 5 years, his name was Little Fox, darted between the fires, his eyes bright with mischief. In his haste to evade his pursuer, he stumbled, his small body lurching sideways. He fell against a tripod holding a large clay pot of simmering stew, sending it toppling over. A collective gasp swept through the camp, followed by a child's piercing scream of agony. The stew, thick and scalding, had splashed across the boy's lower leg and foot. His mother was there in an instant, scooping him up, her own cries of panic mingling with his. A crowd gathered immediately. Tala, the old matriarch, pushed her way through, her face grim. The other women offered advice, suggested remedies: a plaster of mud, a dusting of pollen. The camp's order dissolved into a frantic, helpless chaos. Ruth stood frozen at the edge of the scene, her heart pounding against her ribs. The boy's continuous, high-pitched wails of pain were a physical assault. She felt the familiar paralysis of the outsider, the fear of doing the wrong thing. But as she watched the mother try to comfort her sobbing child, a memory, deep and long buried, surfaced with the clarity of a vision. She was a little girl again, no older than Little Fox, in her mother's kitchen. She had reached for a cookie and had laid her forearm against the hot cast-iron stove. She remembered the searing pain, her own terrified screams, and she remembered her mother, not the tired, worn-out woman she had become in her last years, but the mother of her early childhood, a woman with gentle hands and a quiet knowledge of herbs. She remembered her mother's calm voice cutting through her panic, the smell of the cool, green poultice she had prepared, the instant relief as it was spread across the angry red burn. The memory was so powerful, so complete, that Ruth could almost feel the cool paste on her own skin. Comfrey root, mashed to a pulp, the inner gel of the spiky aloe plant, and crushed yarrow leaves to ward off infection. Her mother had called it God's own bandage. Little Fox screamed again, a sound of pure misery. It broke through Ruth's hesitation. She could not stand by and do nothing. She moved forward, her newfound purpose making her bold. "Wait," she said, her voice louder and clearer than she had ever used it in this camp. She pushed gently but firmly past the other women until she stood before the crying mother and the wise woman. "Tala." Tala looked at her, her dark eyes sharp and questioning. The other women fell silent, shocked by the white woman's audacity. Ruth had almost no words, but she had her hands and her certainty. She pointed to the burn, then made a gesture for cold, but not freezing. "Water. Agua," she said, using a Spanish word she had heard Elijah use, hoping they would understand. Then she looked at the hills surrounding the canyon, her mind's eye searching for the plants from her memory. She saw the spiky aloe growing near the rocks, She knew the feathery leaves of the yarrow plant from her foraging lessons with the women. Comfrey was the question, but she remembered her mother saying another plant, knitbone, they called it, would also work. She looked directly at Tala, her eyes pleading for trust. She pointed to the plants she needed, miming the act of crushing them with a stone. For a long moment, Tala studied her face, her gaze intense. Ruth did not flinch. She met the old woman's stare, letting her see the conviction in her eyes. This was not the clumsy girl who couldn't grind flour. This was a woman who knew what to do. Tala gave a slow, deliberate nod. She barked a command to two of the younger women, who immediately ran to fetch water and to gather the plants Ruth had indicated. While they were gone, Ruth knelt by Little Fox. She spoke to him in a low, soothing tone, the same tone her mother had used with her. The English words were meaningless to him, but the gentle, calm cadence of her voice seemed to quiet his sobs into ragged whimpers. She carefully cut away the deerskin legging that was sticking to the angry, blistering skin, her hands steady and sure with her bone-handled knife. When the women returned, Ruth got to work. Using a clean medity, she mashed the thick aloe gel, the fibrous root, and the pungent yarrow leaves into a thick, green, fragrant paste. The women of the camp watched in utter silence, their skepticism giving way to fascination. Her movements were confident, her purpose clear. She took a generous amount of the cool poultice and gently, tenderly, spread it over the boy's burn. Little Fox, who had tensed for another wave of pain, let out a long, shuddering sigh of relief as the cool balm soothed his fiery skin. His crying stopped. Ruth wrapped the leg loosely in a clean strip of hide to hold the poultice in place, then looked up at the boy's mother. The woman's face was wet with tears, but her eyes shone with a gratitude so profound it needed no words. She reached out and grasped Ruth's hand, pressing it to her cheek in a gesture of heartfelt thanks. Ruth looked around the circle of faces. The suspicion was gone. In its place was a new and startling emotion, awe. She had brought healing from a place of chaos. She had revealed a hidden skill, a secret strength they never knew she possessed. Her eyes searched the crowd and found Elijah. He was standing at the back, leaning against a tree, his arms crossed. He had watched the entire drama unfold. As their eyes met across the flickering fire, he gave her a look that was unlike any she had received from him before. It went far beyond the simple acknowledgement of a skill learned. It was a look of profound recognition, of deep and undisguised respect. He was not looking at the too ugly bride his father-in-law had sold him. He was not seeing the clumsy student he had taught to make fire. He was seeing a woman who held the power to give comfort, to restore life, to heal. He was seeing her, Ruth, for the very first time. In that single silent gaze, the last of the debt between them was finally and completely paid. Part 6, Showdown with the Past. The peace that had settled over Ruth's life was as fragile as a desert flower. For several months, she had lived by the rhythms of the sun and the needs of the community. Her hands had become skilled, her heart had become quiet, and the ghost of her father's ranch had begun to fade into a distant, painful memory. She was no longer just the white woman. She was the one who knew the healing herbs, the one whose fire always caught, the one who had earned her place. The past arrived on a cloud of red dust and the thunder of shod hooves. It was late afternoon, and the camp was in a state of relaxed industry. Ruth was helping Tala sort dried herbs, her fingers moving deftly as she separated yarrow from sage. Suddenly, the camp's dogs erupted in a furious, frantic barking. A lookout's sharp cry echoed from the canyon rim. The peaceful hum of the rancheria ceased as if a switch had been thrown. Warriors appeared from their wickiups, rifles and bows materializing in their hands with silent speed. Women gathered their children, their faces hardening into impassive, watchful masks. Ruth's heart leaped into her throat. Her first thought was of the cavalry, or perhaps a rival band. But as the riders crested the rise and galloped recklessly down into the canyon, a cold, familiar dread washed over her, extinguishing the warmth of the afternoon sun. There were 4 riders. The man in the lead, sitting tall and rigid in his saddle, his face a thundercloud of grim determination, was Jedediah Dawson. He looked alien and monstrous in this place of soft curves and earth tones. His black, sweat-stained hat, his heavy leather chaps, and the silver-inlaid Colt revolver strapped to his hip were symbols of a world of sharp edges, a world of ownership and brute force. The 3 men with him were hired guns, their faces hard and their eyes greedy, the kind of men who would do anything for a handful of dollars. They reined in their horses in the center of the camp, scattering chickens and sending dust billowing over the clean-swept ground. Their presence was an act of violation, an invasion of the community's sacred space. "Where is she?" Jedediah boomed, his voice a jarring intrusion into the profound silence that had fallen. "Where is my daughter?" Elijah materialized at Ruth's side as if from the very air itself. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a solid wall. His face was a mask of cold fury. His dark eyes narrowed to slits as he watched the intruders. Around them, the Apache men formed a loose, silent circle, their weapons held at a casual but deadly readiness. Jedediah's eyes scanned the crowd of faces and finally landed on Ruth. A look of profound disgust twisted his features. He took in her deerskin dress, her braided hair, her stained hands. To him, she was not a woman who had adapted and survived. She was a prized sow that had escaped its pen and wallowed in the mud. "Girl," he commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. "Get yourself over here. The disgrace ends today. You're coming home." The word struck Ruth with the force of a physical blow. Home. The word was a lie. He meant she was returning to her cage. The old, conditioned fear rose in her like a tide, making her limbs feel heavy and her breath catch in her throat. For a lifetime, that voice had been law, a power as absolute and unquestionable as God's. Part of her, a terrified, child-like part, wanted to obey, to scurry over to him and accept her punishment just to make the confrontation end. Elijah took a half-step forward, placing himself more fully in front of her. "She is with me," he said, his voice dangerously low. "She is not going anywhere." Jedediah let out a harsh, barking laugh. "With you I made a bargain with you. Greyhawk, a debt was paid. But I've heard stories. Word travels. They say my daughter is playing healer to your whelps, that she's been accepted. I will not have it. My blood will not be diluted by living in a den of savages. My property is being misused." He spat on the ground. "I've come to reclaim what's mine." The word hung in the air, property. It was the final, unforgivable insult. It stripped her of her humanity, of the new identity she had so painstakingly built. She was not a person to him. She was an object, a lost tool he had come to retrieve. Something inside Ruth snapped. It was not a conscious decision, but a deep, primal rejection of everything he represented. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a white-hot, cleansing anger. She stepped out from behind Elijah's protective form. The movement was small, but its significance was monumental. It was the first time in her life she had ever willingly stepped into the path of her father's wrath. Jedediah's eyes widened in surprise. He was not used to her moving toward conflict, only shrinking from it. "Get behind me, girl," he snarled. "This is between men." "No," Ruth said. The word was quiet, but it rang with the clarity of a bell in the tense silence. Everyone heard it. Jedediah, Elijah, Tala, the entire camp. She took another step forward, her eyes locked on her father's face. "This is not between men. This is about me." Jedediah's face purpled with rage. He was losing control, and he could not stand it. He fell back on his oldest and cruelest weapon. He sneered, his lip curling back from his teeth, and pointed a trembling finger at her forehead. "Look at you," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "Dressed in skins like an animal. You think you belong here? You think they'll ever see you as anything but a white stray? That mark on your face makes you ugly, girl. It doesn't matter if you're in a church or a mud hut. It's who you are, a flawed, ugly thing." His words were meant to be the killing blow, the final verbal assault that would shatter her nerve and send her scurrying back to him in shame. He had used that scar to control her for 15 years. It was the source of his power over her. But he was speaking to a different woman now. She was no longer the girl who believed him. She had felt Elijah's gaze on her, a gaze that saw past the scar to the woman beneath. She had earned the respect of Tala and the gratitude of Little Fox's mother. She had made a life with her own 2 hands. His weapon was useless now. It had no target left to hit. Slowly, deliberately, Ruth raised her own hand and laid her fingers against her scar. The skin was familiar, a part of her. She did not flinch from her own touch. She looked her father squarely in the eye, her own gaze clear and unwavering. Her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. It was filled with a strength she never knew she possessed. "This mark," she said, her voice carrying across the silent clearing, "is not a mark of shame. It is the mark of a fall I survived when I was a child." She held his gaze, refusing to look away. "And you," she continued, her voice dropping, filled with the weight of years of pain. "I survived you." A collective intake of breath rippled through the Apache onlookers. They might not have understood the English words, but they understood the tone. They understood the power of a spirit unshackling itself. "I am not your property, father," Ruth declared, the word father an accusation, not an endearment. "I am not a debt to be paid or a tool to be reclaimed. I am a woman, and I choose to stay here. This is my home now." Jedediah Dawson stared at her, his mouth hanging slightly open. He was utterly defeated. He had ridden in here with guns and bravado, expecting to face down a half-breed scout and drag a terrified girl home. He was prepared for a fight of bullets and blades. He was not prepared for this. He was not prepared to be confronted by a woman who had claimed her own soul. His power had never been in his fists or his gun. It had been in her fear. It had been rooted in her belief that she was the worthless, ugly thing he told her she was. Now, that belief was gone, and his power had vanished with it. He was just an angry, blustering old man, a tyrant with no one left to tyrannize. He looked from his daughter's defiant, transfigured face to the cold, unblinking eyes of Elijah Greyhawk. He looked at the silent circle of warriors, their arrows nocked, their rifles aimed not at his chest, but at his soul. He saw with blinding clarity that there was nothing for him here to win, because the thing he had come to claim no longer belonged to him. It had never truly belonged to him at all. With a strangled cry of pure, impotent rage, he wrenched his horse's head around. "Then rot here!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "Rot with the rest of them!" He spurred his horse viciously, and he and his hired guns galloped out of the camp, their humiliating retreat a stark contrast to their arrogant arrival. They disappeared over the rise, leaving only a fading cloud of dust and a profound, ringing silence in their wake. Ruth stood watching them go, her body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. The past was gone. She had faced it, and she had won. Part 7. The Flame of Acknowledgement. The dust settled, but the silence that Jedediah Dawson left behind was a living thing, charged with the energy of the confrontation. Ruth remained standing in the center of the clearing, her body a taut wire of defiance. She watched the spot on the horizon where her father had vanished, and with his disappearance, the entire brutal architecture of her past life crumbled to dust. She had done it. She had spoken the truth that had been locked inside her for 15 years. But the strength that had flooded her veins now drained away, leaving a terrifying emptiness in its wake. A violent tremor started in her hands and spread through her entire body. The ground seemed to shift beneath her feet. She had severed the final tie to the world she was born into. She had chosen this new life. But in doing so, she had made herself an orphan, a true castaway. The sheer, terrifying magnitude of her decision washed over her, and her knees threatened to buckle. Before she could fall, a firm, wrinkled hand gripped her arm, steadying her. She looked into the dark, knowing eyes of Tala. The old woman's face was no longer just impassive or respectful. It was filled with a fierce, maternal pride. Tala said nothing, but squeezed her arm once, a gesture that spoke volumes. "You are one of us. You defended your place. We will hold you up." One by one, the other women of the camp came forward. Little Fox's mother touched her shoulder, her eyes shining with unshed tears of gratitude. Another woman pressed a small, intricately woven basket into her hands. They were small gestures, but they were threads, weaving her into the fabric of the community, assuring her that she was not alone. They were welcoming their warrior home. Finally, when the women had given her their silent support and retreated to their own fires, only Elijah remained. He stood before her, his face unreadable in the deepening twilight. The entire camp seemed to hold its breath, watching. He reached out, not to her arm, but to her hand, his strong fingers gently closing around hers. "Come," he said, his voice a low rumble that soothed the frantic beating of her heart. "It is over." He led her to the fire in front of their wickiup and gently pushed her down to sit on the blanket. She sank onto it, her body finally surrendering to the bone-deep exhaustion. The trembling returned. A violent, uncontrollable shaking born of adrenaline and years of repressed fear finally breaking free. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold her splintering world together. She felt stripped bare, her soul laid open for all to see. She had won, but she felt as fragile as a hollow eggshell. Elijah sat beside her, so close that their knees were almost touching. He did not speak, did not offer empty platitudes of comfort. He simply sat with her in her shaking silence, his presence a solid, unshakable anchor in the storm that raged inside her. He let her feel it all, the terror, the grief, the triumphant, terrible freedom. When the worst of the tremors had passed, leaving her limp and spent, he moved. He reached out, his calloused fingers infinitely gentle, and brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. His touch was as light as a moth's wing, yet it sent a current of warmth through her. Her breath hitched. He did not pull his hand away. Instead, he slowly, deliberately, laid his fingertips on her scar. She flinched instinctively, a lifetime of conditioning making her want to recoil from any touch to that hated mark. But his touch was not one of judgment or disgust. It was a touch of quiet exploration, of acceptance. His thumb moved in a slow, soothing stroke along the raised line of flesh, as if he were memorizing the map of her oldest wound. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and questioning in the firelight. His face was closer than it had ever been before. She could see the deep, steady light in his eyes, the compassion that he held so carefully guarded behind his stoic mask. He leaned in, his voice a low, intimate whisper meant only for her. "This is not weakness," he said, his thumb coming to rest on the center of the scar. "This is survival." His words were the echo of her own defiant declaration, but hearing them from him was a validation that settled deep in her soul. He was not just accepting her past, he was honoring it. He saw the mark not as a flaw that made her ugly, but as the proof of her strength, the emblem of every battle she had endured and won. In his eyes, her greatest shame was her greatest badge of honor. The last of her defenses crumbled. A single tear escaped and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. Elijah caught it with his thumb, his gaze never leaving hers. The space between them grew charged, filled with all the unspoken words, all the shared silences, all the trials they had faced together. The world narrowed to the crackling of the fire and the beating of their two hearts. He lowered his head, his movement slow, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not move. She did not breathe. She watched as his face drew closer, his eyes dark and full of a raw, tender emotion she had never seen before. When his lips finally met hers, they were warm and gentle, a stark contrast to the harshness of the world they inhabited. It was not a kiss of claiming or of passion, but of discovery. It was a question, and her soft, yielding response was the answer. It tasted of wood smoke and desert air and a profound, aching tenderness that she had never imagined could exist. In that moment, the central promise of her life's cruelest bargain was fulfilled. She had been sent to a Half-Apache stranger as a punishment, a thing to be discarded, and in his arms, by this small fire, she found the gentle love that had been waiting for her all along. The kiss was a seal, marking the end of her life as Jedediah's daughter and the true beginning of her life as herself. It was the moment of her rebirth. In the days that followed, a new and beautiful quiet settled between them. They moved around each other with an awareness that had not been there before. A shared glance across the fire, a brief touch of hands as he passed her a tool each was a silent conversation, an affirmation of the bond that had been forged in fire and cemented with a kiss. About a week after the confrontation, Tala approached them as they sat eating their evening meal. She spoke to Elijah in their tongue, her gaze moving between him and Ruth. When she was finished, Elijah turned to Ruth. She says, "You have chosen your people, and the people have chosen you." He translated softly. She says, "It is time for our lives to be tied in the eyes of the community." Ruth's heart fluttered. Tied. "We have no preacher in a black coat, no book of rules," he explained. "Our unions are a promise made before the people who will help us keep it. A binding." The ceremony was held 2 nights later. At sunset, the entire camp gathered in a circle at the heart of the rancheria. There were no flowers, no white dress, no solemn music. There was only the vast, painted sky, the warm, breathing earth, and the assembled faces of her new family. Ruth wore the simple deerskin dress she had been given on her first day, but Tala had adorned her hair with a single eagle feather, a mark of great honor. Elijah stood beside her, not in his scout's trousers, but in a simple hide tunic and leggings. He looked less like a man caught between two worlds and more like a man who had finally chosen his. Tala stood before them, holding a long, single strip of soft leather, decorated with intricate beadwork and small, sacred herbs. She began to speak in a low, chanting voice, her words rising and falling like the evening breeze. Elijah murmured the meaning to Ruth. She speaks of the 2 hawks who choose to circle the same sky, of the 2 roots that grow intertwined beneath the earth, so that one may draw strength from the other when the ground is dry. She says, "A man alone is weak, a woman alone is weak, but together they are a shelter against the storm." Tala took Ruth's right hand and Elijah's left. She placed them one on top of the other, palm to palm. Then, with slow, deliberate motions, she began to wrap the leather cord around their joined hands. The cord was cool against Ruth's skin. With each wrap, Tala spoke a blessing for strength in hardship, for joy in seasons of plenty, for healthy children, for a long life together. As the last knot was tied, Ruth looked at their bound hands. This simple leather cord felt more powerful, more sacred than any cold metal ring. It was not a symbol of ownership, but of partnership. It was a promise to hold on, to work together, to face whatever came, bound by choice and mutual respect. Tala raised their joined hands for the camp to see. A warm, joyful cry went up from the people. They were not just witnesses, they were participants, their voices a promise to uphold and support this union. As the sun dipped below the canyon rim, casting them in a final, golden light, Elijah turned to her. His hand, still bound to hers, tightened its grip. He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw her future. It would not be easy. It would not be perfect. but it would be a life of purpose, of belonging, and of a gentle, resilient love. She was no longer the too ugly bride. She was Ruth Greyhawk, a healer, a survivor, a wife. She was home. Part 8, a new season, a new life. The seasons turned, painting the canyon in the muted colors of the desert. The harsh sun of summer gave way to the crisp, cool air of autumn, and then to the stark, quiet beauty of a mild winter. With each turning season, Ruth's roots grew deeper into the red earth of her new home, the woman who had arrived as a frightened, silent outcast was gone, replaced by a person she was only just beginning to know herself. Her life was a tapestry woven from the threads of daily tasks, each one meaningful and essential. Mornings were for work alongside the other women tanning the hides from the autumn hunt until they were as soft as butter, grinding the last of the stored corn, or weaving yucca fibers into strong, durable baskets. In these circles of women, she found the easy, supportive community she had never known. They communicated in a mixture of the Apache words Ruth had diligently learned, Spanish trade phrases, and a universal language of gestures and knowing smiles. They taught her which roots were for healing and which were for dye, and she, in turn, taught them the simple English words for the things they held in their hands. They no longer saw her as the white woman. They saw her as Ruth, the one with the clever hands for medicine and the patient way with children. Her afternoons were often spent with the young ones. The Apache children were fascinated by her stories of the world beyond the canyon, a world of square houses and iron horses, which sounded to them like the most outlandish fairy tales. She taught them rhymes and songs her own mother had taught her, and watched, her heart full, as their high, sweet voices sang about London Bridge in the middle of the Apache heartland. Little Fox, his leg now healed with only a faint, silvery scar to mark the accident, was her constant shadow, following her with a devotion that was both touching and amusing. Her bond with Elijah was the quiet, steady center of her world. It was a love that lived not in grand declarations, but in the small, intimate moments of their shared life. It was in the way he would return from a hunt and place the best piece of meat by her cook fire without a word. It was in the way she would have a hot broth ready for him when he returned, cold and weary, from a long patrol. It was in the shared silence as they watched the stars emerge in the night sky, his shoulder a warm, solid presence against hers. He still played his flute for her in the evenings, and the music was no longer a song of loneliness, but a song of contentment, of two solitary hawks who had, against all odds, learned to circle the same sky. The outside world, with its harsh judgments and cruel demands, seemed a lifetime away. But one day, it came visiting. He was a man named Arthur Penwright, a journalist from Philadelphia, and he was hopelessly out of his element. He arrived escorted by two nervous army scouts, dressed in a woolen suit wholly unsuited for the climate, his face pinked by the sun, and his boots covered in a layer of dust. He clearly found offensive. He had come, he announced with a flourish, to find the white rose of the wilderness, the angel of the Apache. He was looking for her. Elijah met him with his usual cool suspicion, but the man was persistent, producing a letter of passage from a general at Fort Davis. He had heard the story, he explained, a garbled, sensationalized version pieced together from the whispers of trappers and soldiers. It was a tale of a beautiful, wronged maiden, cruelly traded to the savages, who had won them over with her Christian pity and civilized grace, culminating in a dramatic showdown with her villainous father. He wanted to write her story for a popular Eastern serial. He promised her fame, recognition, and perhaps even a rescue. He interviewed Ruth by the creek, with Elijah sitting nearby, his face an unreadable mask of stone. Mr. Penwright's questions were a barrage of romantic assumptions. "Tell me, Mrs. Greyhawk," he began, his pencil poised eagerly over his notepad. "Describe the terror you must have felt, being handed over to a man of the wilderness, the sheer barbarity of the transaction. Ruth looked at Elijah, then back at the journalist. "My father was a hard man," she said simply, "and my husband was honorable. He paid a debt." Mr. Penwright blinked, his narrative already faltering. "But your defiance, the dramatic moment you stood up to your cruel father, the stories say you spoke with the fire of an avenging angel." "I told him I was not his property to reclaim," Ruth said, remembering the tremor in her voice, the terror in her heart. There had been no angelic fire, only the desperate courage of a cornered animal. "I told him I was staying." "Incredible," the man breathed, scribbling furiously. "And your famous scar. They say it is a mark of unspeakable tragedy, a constant, painful reminder of the life you lost. May I?" He gestured toward her forehead. For a moment, Ruth had almost forgotten it was there. She no longer checked for it in her reflection in the water. She no longer felt the phantom sting of her father's gaze upon it. It was simply a part of the landscape of her own face. Without a thought, she pushed back her hair. Mr. Penwright leaned in, his eyes wide with a writer's ghoulish fascination. "Remarkable. A true emblem of your ordeal." Ruth looked at him, and for the first time she felt not anger or shame, but a profound and gentle pity for this man. He could only see the world through the lens of his dramatic stories. He couldn't see the simple, complicated truth. "It's just a scar, Mr. Penwright," she said, her voice soft. "It means I fell when I was a child, and I got up again. Most people have them, in one way or another. All they mean is that you've lived." The journalist eventually left, his head filled with a story that she knew would bear little resemblance to her actual life. He would write his legend of the white rose of the wilderness, and people back east would read it and marvel at her bravery and her tragedy. The thought did not move her. She had no need for the approval of strangers in a world she no longer belonged to. Her worth was not a story to be printed on cheap paper. It was in the healthy sheen of little Fox's hair. It was in the grateful eyes of a mother whose child she had healed. It was in the quiet pressure of Elijah's hand in hers. She had been sent away as a burden, a flawed and ugly thing. But here, in this place, she was meant to see as a punishment. She had become essential. She had been loved not in spite of her scar, but in a world where it simply didn't matter. It was not a mark of shame, but a testament to the simple, incredible fact of her own survival. That evening, as the sun began its slow descent, Elijah took her hand and led her up the winding path to the top of the canyon rim. From there, the whole world seemed to spread out before them. The rancheria below was a collection of warm, glowing lights, each one a family, a home. The vast, rugged landscape stretched to the horizon, a land of harsh beauty and unforgiving truths. It was not a paradise. Life here was hard, and often short. Winter could be cruel, and sickness was a constant shadow. But it was real, and it was theirs. Elijah did not speak. He simply brought his flute to his lips and began to play. The melody drifted out over the canyon, a sound of peace, of homecoming. It was the song of the two hawks, circling the same sky. Ruth leaned her head against his shoulder, her eyes on the horizon. The future was an unknown country, a landscape of unpromised seasons. There would be hardship, there would be joy, there would be life. It would not be a perfect story, like the one Mr. Penwright would write, but it would be their story. And for the first time in her life, she felt a profound and unwavering hope. The wind picked up, carrying the sound of the flute out into the vast, open spaces. A promise whispered to the coming night. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Night, and give this video a like to help this story reach more listeners. Please also consider supporting us by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us.